Hi, welcome to class today. I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State. We're continuing our discussion on war and nuclear war, and today's topic is just war and war against humanity. As we're doing this discussion today, we'll be talking about some explicit topics, and there will also be some explicit footage. So I'd like you to be aware of that. And I have a guest today helping me with our discussion. This is Dr. Wayne Hanowitz.
Good morning.
Thanks for
Thank
being
you.
here. And the students today, Wayne, are over here. We've got John and Rhonda. And over here we've got TJ and Kisper. So thanks all of you for being here. And Wayne, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and how you have an interest in a topic such as just war?
Yes, I worked for the Department of Defense for about 20 years, and I teach usually social justice issues and the impact of technology on social justice.
Thank you. And you come to us from Michigan.
I
So
do.
just like our student on the set, Rhonda, we've
Yes.
got two Michiganders with us
We've
today.
talked about that.
Yeah, so that's nice. As we talk about war, we look at, can there be rules in war? And Thomas Hobbes didn't seem to think that there could be rules in war. Do you think there can be rules in war, Wayne?
Yes, there can be rules in war, and that doesn't mean that they're sufficiently good to justify war. We can talk about that. But there are things that you can restrain from doing, and people do that. The one part that isn't talked about in the reading very much, I just want to make it clear, is that there are a number of people who feel that the phrase just war is contradictory, that there can be no just war. And we don't talk about that in the reading much, but it would be nice to have that in the background as we have our discussion.
Okay, thank you. And how about you students? Any thoughts on this question? Can there be rules in war? Or does the person who keep rules in war end up losing? Or the side? Maybe it's not a good either or, John, but what happens?
Well, I think that historically we have a lot of examples of when there are rules in war, they are usually broken, and I think maybe that's because of the nature of war.
And then we'll have tribunals, and we might have different war courts, but it's a very tough thing when it's happening. Thank you. And Rhonda?
I think that not only should you have rules in war, but that you must have rules. And I think that more often, or it seems to me more often than not, there is one side that follows them a bit better than the other. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but the wars that I've seen in the last century, that seems to be more true than not.
Okay, thank you. And Wayne, maybe it would be appropriate to ask you what the term rules of engagement mean.
Yeah, these are rules typically set up. They're not always set up for both or all parties, but usually at least one party has rules of engagement for its forces. The United Nations will have rules of engagement whenever it sends a unit out. Sometimes you like them, sometimes you don't. One typical rule of engagement is they're not allowed to engage in any kind of fire. And so often they'll be sitting by while some tragedy is occurring, but they're just not allowed to act on it. You saw a little bit of that in Rwanda, the movie, Hotel Rwanda. That does occur.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments from students? Well, we have some footage that, as I mentioned before, is somewhat explicit, that shows some car bombings in Iraq. And I think I'd like to show this footage and then talk a little bit about rules of engagement during a war, maybe where terrorism is part of that. So let's go ahead and show that clip.
Did you ever read the book Shit?
Okay, so in this footage then you can see that they're just driving down the highway and suddenly they see a car bomb go off, and here you see the wreckage from it then. Amazing to be that close to something so very destructive then.
So many people have been lost their lives through these kinds of car bombs.
Yes, absolutely. Now, this footage comes to us from a tape that many soldiers, I guess, have sent in footage that they've found. And so, just when you're not expecting something like this, then it happens. Tell us a little bit about rules of engagement in these kinds of situations where it's something you're really not expecting.
Rules of engagement are easier to do when it's one sovereign state in war with another sovereign state. When it isn't a particularly clear sovereign state, for example, Iraq is a good case for that. The rules of engagement are harder. Usually an insurgency has different rules of engagement, and some would call them more lax, some would call them, for an insurgency the motivation is different, the background is different, rules of engagement might be different. In this case here, a typical rule of engagement can either be legal, which means, for example, you don't want to violate the War Crimes Act, which would mean, for example, shooting directly into populated areas. But it's also a war crime to hide your military in populated areas, or to put your weapons in populated areas. Most sovereign states will try to avoid that. Insurgencies may not, because they're fighting for a different motivation.
Okay, thank you. Kisper, why do you think it is a war crime to put your soldiers, to put your munitions in a populated area?
Because there's so many citizens who are innocent who really have nothing to do with the war, and they're in a way getting punished for just being there and existing.
Thank you. And so Bertram Lesser, as we look at this article, he's going to tell us that we have these areas of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but he also says there was a reason why we had to come up with this just war concept, and it had to do with Christianity. So as you think about Christianity, TJ, you think about, turning the other cheek, and could this continue to happen if they were being invaded and their property was taken away and their families being destroyed? Absolutely not,
No,
yeah. And so they said, well, we've got to come up with some rules that say we can protect ourselves, we can protect our families, that everything's going to be just fine. And so that's how we get this just war concept. It's pretty good. So let's go ahead and read the first graphic that we have that starts telling us how these things come about. And TJ, I'll have you go ahead and read this for us. And it's called Official Powers.
Okay. Those who are familiar with the course of events know that it is difficult to make charges stick in instances of abuse of official powers.
Okay, so as we're starting to talk about this, Rhonda, we're visiting about someone who has official powers. It might be a president, it might be a king, it might be a prime minister, and someone's going to say they've committed a war crime. But do you think it is going to be hard to make it stick, and why?
Absolutely. It'll be very difficult to make it stick. I think there's probably a number of reasons. They're acting on behalf of their government, or that it's. I don't know some of the other things. I'm sure that Wayne could fill in that better than I could.
Okay, thank you. And in fact, Wayne, would you like to tell us a little bit about, historically, do they get punished, especially if they're the winners?
Usually not. War crimes are best legislated when it's legislated by a body that supersedes particular sovereignties. The World Tribunal, for example. I think Milosevic was the last one we had. I'm sure he died before the trial was finished. And there's a war crime now trial in Iraq, as you know, from Saddam Hussein. The United States is accused of war crimes often. This happens, and usually it's legislated or arbitrated at some kind of world body that supersedes particular sovereignties, and that's very hard to do. It's almost impossible to do within a sovereignty. For you or I to accuse the president of a war crime and try to legislate that within the United States is difficult. The other thing it is important to say is that while it's difficult to sustain an accusation of war crimes, a lot depends on the operative political theory of the sovereignty. In a democracy, it's easier to make the case. Not easy, but easier. In the early Soviet Union, or say Nazi Germany, it was virtually impossible to make such an accusation stick.
Okay, thank you. And so we start saying, well, where is it that we wanted to come up with some kind of rules of engagement? Let's look at this next graphic. And John, would you read this for us, please?
Yes. Divine right of kings. Ancient doctrines that can be traced far beyond the medieval theory of the divine right of kings interpose nearly insurmountable obstacles between the citizen who believes that he has been injured by an officer of the state and the satisfaction of any claim that he may make for reparation of the injury or retribution against the wrongdoer.
And continue.
No one could prosecute a king, for who would hear the case? Who would serve as the judge? And who would declare the law?
Okay, so what about that, John? No one's going to be able to prosecute the king.
Well, the king has absolute power, absolute rule. over the nations. So I mean, yeah, he's basically you can't touch him.
Okay, thank you. So basically what you were just saying then, Wayne. Anyone, is this news to anyone? Okay, kind of figured that was what was going on. So then let's look at the victim and see how this comes out. And Rhonda, would you read this one for us, please?
Even more difficult, however, is the problem of the aggrieved party who considers himself a victim of unjustified aggression on the part of a foreign state. To whom shall he turn for relief? What court will hear his argument and pass judgment against a sovereign nation?
Okay, so why is this such an important question, Kisper?
Well, it's saying how is he going to get his point across? How is he going to back his accusation if he's going up against this power?
Mm-hmm. Okay, what are some troubling war crimes that any of you might have seen where you felt like that the victim or the victims should have had some redress and you didn't know if they ever would get this? Yes, John.
I've read a lot about the situation in Rwanda that Wayne mentioned earlier, and I know that there were war crimes tribunals afterward,
Mm-hmm.
and I for probably a very good reason. Now, there's some questions about how fair those were, but I mean that was definitely a situation where victims deserved some kind of method of trying to correct the situation.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
Rhonda?
The case of the Islam men being held in Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows at this point in time what should be addressed, what shouldn't be addressed, whether it's a crime, who is supposed to be who is able actually to declare what they say is held against them, and what government is doing the wrong.
Okay, thank you. Wayne?
Just one comment. It's a great example. And one of the reasons is we talked about war being promulgated by sovereignties. One of the controversies here is whether these are war prisoners. Was there a declared war? Can an insurgency declare a war against a sovereign state? And if it can, and these people are caught in the middle of war, are they war prisoners? Or are they just criminals? That's part of the controversy. How do you try these people? And that's one of the difficulties I think the United States is in right now, trying to resolve it.
Okay, so there are always difficulties then
Yeah.
with the victim getting reparation.
Yeah,
whether
there are
it's
some
in-
people say we're not in a war
whether it's
because an
in-
insurgency can't declare a war.
Sure,
Yeah.
okay, so it might be the Serbians, the Croats, it could
Yeah.
be anywhere around the globe. The victim is still going to have, and victims will have
Right.
problems. Okay, let's pull up the next graphic, and Kisper, would you read this for us, please?
Ancient rule of justice. An ancient and respected rule of justice decrees that no one would be convicted or punished for any act that was not forbidden by the law at the time that he committed it. The sovereign may rightly point out that the law under which he performed his allegedly criminal acts was the law of the land at the time.
Okay, thank you. So this goes right back then to what you were telling us, Wayne, initially, that any culture can say, this is the law of the land. Historically, culturally, it's been the way we've done things. We've even got it on the books. So they'll say, you cannot hold a trial against me for war crimes.
May I just
Well,
add one
please
thing
do.
to that?
Yeah.
It is true that legislation passes from the head of the sovereignty, but it is not true that justice is defined by the head of the sovereignty. It could be that that's the law, but it doesn't mean the law is just. And you can challenge a sovereignty if you make the case that the law is unjust. There are sovereignties where you're not allowed to do that. In most developed nations, you do have the opportunity to say that might be that this agency passed the law and you're the source of the law, but you're not the source of the moral principles that we assess the law by.
Okay, thank you. So justice is going to be different than from
From
how
legality.
the sovereignty
Right.
would like to, the sovereign would like to see this
Right.
then. Okay. Any comments or questions on this? Okay, great. Well, TJ, would you read our next graphic for us, please?
Sure. The just war concept. The concept of just war extends back through the Middle Ages into late Hellenistic times, and beyond that even into biblical times. Christians taught that violence could be used, if necessary, to repel invading forces in order to protect the innocent against harm to which they might otherwise have been subjected.
Okay, and so we see this coming around about the time of Constantine, who says, we understand now you're a large body of folk, and you need to have some ability to protect yourself. So we have Constantine who helps give them permission, and then we have Augustine and Aquinas who help them refine these notions of just war. So John, what are your thoughts on just war? Does it work? Is it acceptable?
Well, I think, as we're going to find out, one of the interesting things about just war is that if everyone were to follow just war, there would be no violence perpetrated against anyone else. And in that way, I think that it might be a good idea, but I think it's also important to point out that just war did come out. It was a concept it kind of formed around Constantine, right? Before that, the Christians were absolute pacifists, and they would lay down and die before they would fight back. And so it's kind of interesting how that changes in their history.
Okay, thank you. And
so
Kisper.
this is just saying here that they can protect the innocent and use war in order to do so. Is that what it's saying?
It is. That's what it's saying. So that even though we have these doctrines of Jesus Christ that say, you will turn the other cheek, that, you won't bring aggression against someone else, that just war is saying you can defend yourself. So, Rhonda.
Well, that's why I'm not sure if it would be the case that if everybody followed, the tenets of just war, that, as John said, no one would be involved in it. I'm not sure that that's true. I think that everybody has their idea of what just is, and for that reason, I think war would continue.
I think that your point's very good, Rhonda, because you're talking about mass death, and you're talking about issues of families being disrupted, separated from one another, and families having casualties. And so what do we do when this happens, when this is happening in war? And everyone is going to have an opinion on it. Does this meet the just war criterion? Is this a war crime? Thoughts about that, about political opinion and how tough it is around the issue of war?
Gandhi was a good example of this. Gandhi's position was not that having a war was at the bottom of his bag of tricks, it's that it wasn't in the bag, just not to be considered. So I guess I'd ask you, do you think, would any of you be willing to live by that rule? That it's just not in the bag for you? You'd be willing to simply give your life rather than defend other people you would consider innocent? Would any of you be willing to do that? Under what conditions would you not be willing to do that?
Threat to family or even friends.
Yeah.
But Gandhi was prepared to do that. What's different?
Gandhi was miraculous.
Even one person.
Yeah.
I think,
Well, it was a whole nation that followed, and the British did leave.
But it was that nation.
Okay. Understand.
Any other comments?
I think it'd be difficult to do, personally, to see things happening to innocent people, to family or friends, or even to a nation who's in a way innocent, and not do something about it. That would be difficult for me.
Sure.
It's hard enough to see, the family, be killed, say like in earthquakes. There's no one that's, it's an act of God, it's nature. But when somebody comes in and annihilates my family, that's a whole other case.
How far would you be willing to go? In Tibet, most of the Buddhist monks, of course, were brutalized. Some were required, the children were required to hold guns and shoot their parents while the guns were in their hands. Under those conditions, if you knew for a fact that was true, would you be willing to go to war over it?
I'm not sure I'm understanding. Would I be willing to go to war?
Would you be willing to step in as a third country and say, this can't happen? We're willing to defend
Yes, I would.
Would you be willing to?
I would.
But we didn't.
And I know, and I don't understand why some countries we go to bat for and other countries we don't. Where it certainly looks like it's justified. I guess it depends on what's in it for us, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, and certainly we do have different leaders who say, let's step outside the box, let's shift the paradigm. Are there other solutions besides taking up arms? What else can be done? Anything from economic threats to other embargoes. So it is a very challenging question. Well, let's go ahead and look at some of our just war criterion. And this comes to us from a reading that's found in your supplemental reader. It's by Michael Minch, When Soldiers Aren't Heroes. And these are some points that Michael has put together from his research. And let's go ahead and look at these 7 points that he has. And would you read this for us, Rhonda?
I would agree with you, Elaine, that Michael Minch's article in the supplemental reading really ought to be looked at, because it's very provocative and very deep thinking, and it would be good to read with this this particular area. Anyway, the just war criterion, there are elaborate accounts that have been developed over the years giving criterion for a just war. These criterions are from Michael Minch's article, When Soldiers Aren't Heroes. Number 1, have a just cause. 2, be waged by a legitimate authority. 3, be formally declared. 4, be fought with a peaceful intention. Peace must be its goal. 5, be a last resort. 6, have a reasonable probability of success. And 7, use means proportionate to the end sought.
Okay, thank you. So we have 7 rules that are brought up here by Michael. And Michael, in his article, doesn't believe that these can be met or are met, and that there just really aren't just wars. But we can start out and say, well, we have a just cause, and maybe we can go back to the war in Desert Storm. A just cause. What might have been the just cause in that case? Any of you? John?
I'm not really sure. I'm going to have to pass on that one.
Okay, that's fine. Wayne, what would have been the just cause on that?
Well, we're talking Iraq War I.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that was to remove Saddam's forces from Kuwait because it was considered an unjust appropriation of Kuwait sovereignty.
Okay, and so the tanks were ready to roll across, and so they started moving, and then the war was formally declared. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then we move on, and it's fought with a peaceful intention. Now, what that means, I think, one of the ways that I interpret that is that there are rules of engagement, and that you do this as quickly as possible, that there would be no prolongation of the combat, of the conflict, that as quickly as possible you are in, take care of the problem, and you're out. How does that work with the peaceful intention?
That war was fought quicker than any war in history.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the few days that it was fought, there are controversial moments. One was the moment of what's loosely referred to as the Highway of Death, where Iraqi soldiers were trying to get out of Kuwait as much as possible. And what happened is the lead vehicle was shot up, the last vehicle was shot up, and so everyone was caught in between. The problem is that there were also a lot of civilians getting out of there at the same time, and they were stuck in the middle there. Of course, that's hard to see at 10,000 feet when you're looking down. So as short as that war was, still very controversial moments in that war, and one's not sure whether that was the right thing to do or not. On the other hand, it was the intention to simply get the forces out of Kuwait. So once that was done, people say, well, why didn't you just finish the job and get rid of Saddam? Well, the job was simply to get them out of Kuwait, not to invade Iraq and finish Saddam. Once that was done, the forces stopped and they were removed. So in that sense, they tried very hard with the rules of engagement to meet that criterion. But even as hard as it was and as short as it was, you have those controversial moments in it.
Okay, thank you. Yes, John.
I think it should be pointed out this is kind of a troubling concept, the idea that you can drop bombs to create peace.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I also think that Iraq War II is a good example of when we're not really sure if we can go in there and get out as soon as possible, and you do not really know if that's a possibility until after you've invaded. And so, I mean, we can talk about going in and then finishing our military action as quickly as possible, but who knows in the end what the situation is going to be.
And you know, I think your comment goes along well with the last 3 points, that war should be a last resort, that it should have a reasonable probability of success. So you've mapped it out. You know, of course, none of us, we can all be the Monday morning quarterback. None of us know how this will work out. And then the use means proportionate to the ends sought. So how much violence is really necessary to take care of this specific problem. So
Well, and then when you have, you know, other factions coming in and out, you know, that are the uprisings of this and the creating of these other little wars here and there, it's really, you know, you get into a tough situation.
Okay, thank you. And Kisper or TJ, any comments on these 7 rules then that have historically been the first area that we'll look at when we're looking at a just war?
I think that oftentimes people going into war believe that they have the just cause, believe that they're doing it as a last resort, believe that they're trying to meet these criteria, but oftentimes they are broken.
Okay. All right. And Wayne, how about you? How do these work out, these 7?
I think Michael's probably right. They sound good. But whether a sovereignty is being disingenuous about its rationale for going to war is another matter. And in this generation, we have a controversy in the United States about the rationale for going to the second Iraq War, say weapons of mass destruction. In addition, you have on top of that the whole notion of preemptive war, which is part of a rationale here, and we're not even talking about that yet. So it's even more complicated than we have.
Very complicated. Yes, thank you. Well, now we have 3 more very important moral criterion, and let's go ahead and pull these up. And would you read these for us, TJ, please?
Sure. Moral criteria for conducting war. 1. Non-combatants must be given immunity. 2. Prisoners must be treated humanely. And 3. International treaties and conventions must be honored.
Okay, so once you are in war, then these 3 areas are a must in the conduct. Kisper, do you want to tell us a little bit about why this would be a strong Christian point, why these 3 would be so important?
Well, as we talked about earlier about how you can go into war to protect the innocent. Well, if that's the point of going to war, then obviously non-combatants should be given immunity, and you should be trying to protect the innocent and not go after them. That's one point.
Okay, very good. And so this is one of the criterion that has always been part of just war historically, that the innocents and non-combatants are not to be harmed. And so as you brought up earlier with rules of engagement and other wars against humanity, that wars are not to be conducted in areas of population where you have the innocents and the non-combatants. Anything you'd like to add to that, Wayne, about...
Yes, what makes that difficult is if the person you're at war with decides to fight you from a populated area. You're kind of stuck. It gets very difficult. And again, in your generation, you've seen that, and you'll probably see it again.
Well, and in the first Iraq War, we saw that, where... and didn't know if there were mistakes, where perhaps was this really a munitions area, or that was situated directly in a neighborhood, or was it not? So.
Yeah, your comment about the precision of what's going to happen and the information you get is the basis for what's loosely called the fog of war. We can probably say with precision almost nothing about what will happen once the war starts. You can do pretty good at it, but you don't really know. You're right about that.
Okay. Now, Wayne, if the students are interested in studying international treaties and conventions, where would they go? What sources might you direct them to?
I would say first do some work on the International Criminal Court, War Crimes Court, if you could do that. Second, the UN has been the source of documents and global rules of engagement. Not particularly effective, but they're a place to start. Remember, the UN is, relatively speaking, an infant. So it could be the germ of something larger in the next couple of generations. But I would begin with the International War Court, or Crimes Court, and then also with the United Nations.
Okay, thank you. And in past wars, then, we have learned from mistakes that have been made and determined new conventions, such as the Geneva Convention and others, and then decide, well, we need to update this, we need to add to it now that we have nuclear weapons, other things like this. So, any comments then? Okay, Kisper, would you read the next graphic for us on unjust wars?
Unjust wars. Grotius distinguishes just wars from wars of savages, which are fought out of sheer love of slaughtering and butchering men or facing dangerous situations.
And continued?
And there are also wars of robbers, who are, in the words of Augustine, from the mere lust of ruling, crush peoples who have not troubled them.
And then the last one on this.
Unjust wars are also fought for expansionistic purposes, or also in the name of paternalistic colonialism. This is the desire to rule others against their will on the pretext that it is for their welfare.
Okay, thank you. So here, John, we're saying that wars are fought, unjust wars are fought, number one, for slaughtering, that people just like to go out and fight and kill, and number two, for lust of ruling, that you want to crush the state next to you and take over their property, and the last one, that it's expansionistic, that you just want more and more, and besides that, we're going to take good care of you.
What's scary is that in history we've seen examples of all three. There really have been people who have fought wars based on on these desires, and
continue to fight them.
yeah.
Okay. Wayne, do you want to tell us a little bit about these unjust wars and how sometimes even for the colonization purposes that it's thought of as a very nice thing. We're bringing you our values, our culture, and our wealth, and everything's going to be much better if you're with us.
Yeah, colonial paternalism.
Yeah.
Every developed country probably has that in its history. The difficulty is who gets to define what a just war is. We just don't have that globally. We don't have that kind of mechanism right now, and we badly need that. One of the reasons we don't have it is no sovereignty is willing to submit to another council determining for it what a just war will be.
So it's just a power position that each country is in right now, each sovereignty, and they'll...
The difficulty, a question I would have for all of you, can we be at war without weapons? Do we make war on each other without weapons too?
Mm-hmm.
Suppose
So
we got rid of
you
all
think-
weapons, would we still have wars?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, if we wanted to go back to the question of Gandhi, it is almost like Gandhi fought a war against the British without weapons. So I would say absolutely it is possible to fight a war without
so what
weapons. We've
Hobbes
seen
said.
examples of it.
Right, Hobbes said we could be in a state of war, one against the other.
Well, that's what I was going to say. In the most loose thinking of that, I look at many families. You know, they are. So many are at war with each other, or within the, extended families. You know, there a lot of people use their fists, they use their words.
Yeah. So maybe the issue is, what it comes down to is that there's something in the heart of human beings that still wants to make war. Yeah. And sometime or another, we have to get there, or we'll always have some kind of war.
It's a very good question and a good point, and it goes back to these 3 points brought out by Lesser, that some people just like to use weapons. They are bloodthirsty, they lust for this kind of thing, and it's how they want to fight the war rather than other weaponless means. So, thank you, very good. Well, let's go ahead and read a little bit about universal policy, and could you read this for us, please, John?
Yes. So long as war was a recognized instrument of national policy, both for giving effects to existing rights and for changing the law, the justice or otherwise of the causes of war was not of legal relevance. The right of war, for whatever purposes, was a prerogative of national sovereignty. Thus conceived, every war was just.
Okay, so this is what then Lesser is going to say to us, that every war is just. Rhonda, is every war just then?
No.
Okay. So we're going to see situations then where the war lasts for years and years and years, and we're still wondering about the relevance.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts on this? Wayne, any more
One comment we
notions on
don't
it?
get to say much in the reading here is the impact on war on those individuals who have to make the war. It's hard to kill human beings. It takes a lot of work and training to get someone ready to kill a human being, and they don't forget it typically. Governments make those policies, but governments don't have nightmares, and they don't get depressed, and they don't have guilt. They don't have bad conscience. They don't have bad faith. They don't have to actually kill someone as a human being does. That impact on the future generations and the future of civilization is one the article doesn't get into, but in the end, it's probably the most serious impact of war, what it really does to human beings.
You know, it was interesting in line of that is that today we have so many weapons that can be done at the console, hundreds or thousands of miles away. And I think that takes away the, you know, it's not a game. You know, you're not sitting down to a video game, which I think sometimes it begins to be like. You know, you're not looking the other guy in the eyes.
Well, it can be from using some of that technology,
Yeah.
but wars are still mainly fought eyeball to eyeball,
Oh, I
individuals to
agree.
individuals,
Soldiers
and the
are
impact
those.
on them and how they live after that or don't live after that is something that's not in this article, but it's at the heart of how warfare is conducted.
Thank you, and I think it's a very profound statement for the students to think about, that it is very hard to train a human being to kill another human being, especially if this isn't your upbringing, and sometimes to know that it's either kill or be killed.
In
And
World War II, 80% of the enemy that were killed, by enemy being who the United States was fighting, were killed by 20% of the soldiers. And the reason is the rest of them never aimed their rifle. They just sort of went like this. They didn't really want to kill anyone. And that happened for a long time. It took quite a bit of more intensive training to get a human being to actually want to aim the rifle and kill someone. This is not an easy thing for people to do.
No,
And then also-
reversing that
yes,
would be difficult.
sure, and then not an easy thing to get over when
And
they
not
do
an easy
come
thing to
back
get over
to
it, that's right.
civilization. We call it civilization once we're not in war.
Yes, right. Yes, that's right.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and look at the next couple of graphics on this, and would you read these for us, Rhonda?
Yeah, nations of the world. In the relations among the nations of the world, no enforceable laws regarding warfare existed prior to this century, though there were many moral pronouncements as to what nations should do and what they should refrain from doing.
Okay, and continue on to the next two as well.
Okay, the laws, steps toward a law of war. The laws of the state may be silent as regards the conduct of war, but certain unwritten laws remain in force, even as regards the conduct of hostile nations.
And the next one.
More than once in ancient times it was said that those who committed petty crimes were looked upon as villains and scoundrels, whereas those who murdered men by the thousands, plundered great cities, and kidnapped and enslaved whole populations were hailed as great heroes and military geniuses.
Okay, thank you. So
Powerful.
we have three pretty complicated three pretty complicated graphics here. And what do you think about this first one, where a nation is told what it should do and what it should refrain from doing, particularly in regards to terrorism? Is terrorism something that's acceptable in, let's say, the United States, Great Britain, other NATO countries, Kisper?
Well, absolutely not. For us, terrorism isn't acceptable.
Okay. And so, Wayne, how does terrorism become something that could be a law of war? I mean, how is it something that could be incorporated into that and worked through?
It probably can't, because one of the characteristics of defining terrorism is that it's not a sovereign declaration by a sovereign state. And so to whom would you go to ask that they follow the rules of engagement? It's very difficult to do. Now, terrorism often is sustained by states, but it's always indirectly. The terrorism is a difficult thing to deal with. I remember for us it might seem a terror. For another culture, these might be the heroes. In the revolution, your forefathers and foremothers were terrorists. And then when they became a sovereign state, it was a military. Very difficult.
Okay, thank you. Any other notions about terrorism or war or methods of war that we don't think are acceptable? John?
Well, that's really interesting that Wayne brings up the Revolutionary War, because it's almost like we have heroes in our past that were terrorists. In the United States past, we do have heroes that were terrorists. And that's interesting to think about in the current climate, political climate.
Okay, and called military geniuses.
Yeah.
Yeah, going right along with the reading that we have for today. Other comments or questions? When we're talking about this more than once in ancient times it was said those who committed petty crimes were looked upon as villains and scoundrels, but those who murdered by the thousands and plundered and took over great cities, and these are seen as heroes. Wayne, how does one bring their mind around to that so that the small crimes are big, but the huge killings are not?
The way people would typically make that distinction is one kind of crime is authorized by a sovereign state, and another crime is explicitly forbidden by a sovereign state. So, I mean, that's how you probably make the distinction. Why is it important today? Because even sovereign states don't fight war by the thousands, it's by the millions now. You can have a lot of wars with bows and arrows and rifles. You can only have one global thermonuclear war. So at some point we have to get past even the notion that it's possible to win a war at that level.
Okay, thank you. Other comments or questions? Very good, I like that comment. And let's continue on where we're looking at military heroes. And could you read this for us then, TJ?
Yeah. The military are called in at great risk to themselves to stave off the aggression and to protect the civilian population.
Continued, please.
When there is a clear and immediate danger of overt aggression by one state against another, the threatened state forces may properly bomb and burn the aggressor's tanks and planes, immobilize his troops, and occupy and subdue areas that are strategically located.
Okay, thank you. So there are times when it may be proper to call someone a hero, and other times, particularly with Michael Minch's article saying there are not times when a soldier should be called a hero. Ron, did you want to tell me your views on that?
His article.
Or just on this notion of military heroes?
You know, it's a tough one. I think in any country, including the United States, that we want to view our military men and women as heroes because they are representing our sovereign nation or another nation. And you know, when you go back to the 7 criterion, you know, for having a war, you know, there's a balance. Rather, it's hard to get the balance, you know, of what is what. Hero, you know, implies so many different things. When it comes to war, I think that for the United States, or at least for myself, I guess I can only speak for myself, a hero is one who is trying to protect not just, you know, our way of life, but the rules and laws that we are governed by. And so it's really hard to put the hero in that. I mean, people call football players heroes, and you know, sports persons heroes, and yet, you know, it's our military who is in harm's danger, you know, in harm's way. And yet, it's still hard to know exactly what's the hero. You know, are they doing justly, I suppose?
Sure. You know, it might come down, Wayne, that we look back at the Revolutionary War, and we can see that this was a war that wasn't necessarily fought for property or for gain. It was absolutely about ideal and principle. Yeah. And that maybe the heroes are heroes because of the reason for going into war. That it was this ideal, this everything that's stated in the Declaration of Independence. How would you see that as far as military heroes?
I'm worried about the word hero. I think it's bad for the person calling one a hero, and it's bad for the hero to think that he or she's a hero. On the other hand, I can tell you that, you know, I've seen many people give their lives quite quickly to save a friend, or to fulfill a duty, what they thought was a duty and responsibility, out of great fear, but still overcoming the fear. So while I'd be reluctant to use the word hero, there's some word that I haven't quite grasped yet to describe people who are prepared to do that and have done that. And I might even say, had they not done that, your lives would be different today.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's quite staggering. Kisper.
I definitely believe there are heroes who go to war, and Michael Minch's article talks about since basically no war is just, and since only heroes are ones who fight just wars, there aren't really heroes, even though people do heroic things. And I don't agree with that. I think that there definitely are heroes, the men who go out and fight for the freedom that I have to believe in God and to worship, or the people who go out and fight so that I can fly on an airplane and not worry about it being hijacked. I believe there are many heroes who fight wars.
Exactly. And John, you had a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say, when there is a question as to whether or not a war is just, it doesn't demean the action of actually standing up and standing up for your right to live and your right to your religion. I mean, there is something heroic in just deciding to stand up and do that. But when you've got a sovereign nation deciding what to do with that, and they might be deciding to do something unjust, then there are questions as to whether or not there is something heroic in that. And I think that Michael Minch's article does a really good job of kind of getting to that and asking that question.
It's the asking of the question.
It's the asking the question that's important.
Sure. Not whether or not you agree with it, but actually that you ponder it.
Yeah, and I think it's more of a challenge. It's not a challenge to the people that we call heroes, because there is something heroic about what they're doing, but a challenge to the sovereign nation that takes that and it takes what those people are giving and does something with it that might be unjust.
Okay, thank you. And Rhonda?
You know, I think I would take away any military that's in any country who doesn't fight by the rules of engagement, who likes to kill, or who, because their buddy got killed, will act adverse to that. They act wrong, or those that are supposed to be watching the prisoners and treat them unkind. I don't know if unkind's the right word, but they treat them in opposition, way. Hostily. Those people are not heroes to me. But those who stand on the line to allow me to have the freedoms that I do have are heroes to me.
Okay, so Rhonda's saying we have a lot of kinds of soldiers who are on our side, some of them doing unheroic acts, and others who are doing, just by their being there, is preserving our freedom then. Any thoughts on that, Wayne?
Well, that's a great point that you made, that can someone act heroically in an unjust war? And I think I probably kind of agree with you, probably could. But certainly a question worth asking. And the issue you raised is important also. There's a joke, it's only half a joke though. So it's worth a laugh, but it's worth thinking about.
Okay.
If you can talk intelligently, thank a teacher. If you're not talking in German, thank the military. Only half a joke, but it does tell you that sometimes people do feel a duty and responsibility to a culture or to a civilization or to a sovereignty. Not that they want to do it, but they felt it was their duty. In World War II, people, when the war started, there were people who committed suicide. They committed suicide because they couldn't get in the Army. Quite different from the Vietnam War, wasn't it? The cultures have changed, and our vision of war had changed.
Absolutely.
A lot is changing for us, and that's probably good. If we can get to the point where, as we talked earlier, where we're really looking into our hearts as human beings, where we don't make war on each other all the time, maybe we'll get there.
Maybe we will. Well, let's look at some of the other areas that say, maybe we can help you get there, such as law is the handmaiden of morals. And could you read this one for us, TJ, please?
Yep. Law is the handmaiden of morals. It offers some assurance that which is forbidden by morals, but which moral feelings and beliefs alone are powerless to prevent, will not occur.
Okay, so we have a law, and we hope that because that law is there, that it will also affect our morality, that somehow, whether it's the law or our morals, that we will decide that this is something that we should not be doing. And quite often we're quite powerless to prevent these, especially if someone has a big weapon. But we're hoping then that laws and morals will be respected. Any questions or thoughts on that? Yes, TJ.
One thing that I like when I think of a hero or someone that's moral, I think of integrity. But like for myself, if I was, I would want to be, no matter what situation I was in, I would want to hold up my standards and what I believe, no matter if it was just or unjust, if my country was sending me to do something that I didn't feel was right, I would still want to be, what Rhonda was saying, still want to have that integrity. And from that statement, it seems like it's saying, you're just one person out of thousands or whatever, is it worth it? To me, it would be, but maybe to some people, it's not. But I think that would be something.
It's a better word. You're right.
Mm-hmm. And it's the kind of question we should be asking in an ethics and values class about how important is my integrity, how important is my action, my living with myself. So yes, thank you. Okay, let's pull up the next couple of graphics then. And Kisper, would you read these for us, please?
The law of nations is still in a primitive and rudimentary state. Nowhere is this more evident than in the laws of war.
And continue.
War crimes and crimes against humanity are not merely moral problems, they are legal problems as well. But the law governing war crimes and crimes against humanity is not so well developed as that which governs other areas of human concern.
And the last one.
Not until the 20th century, when tormented mankind suffer through the most barbarous wars ever waged, did the international community finally take its first halting steps toward making the concepts of war crimes and crimes against humanity meaningful and operative in the lives of nations.
Okay, thank you. So we move here, and Wayne, we're back to the starting point that you brought up about laws of nations, and then moving in from these laws of nations which might allow some war crimes, and then are there areas where the different nations can come together and say, these things just aren't acceptable? Do you want to help us out with this just a little bit more, how you would conclude this point?
The most difficult issue for us in our generation, as we talked earlier, and as the graphic indicated, we really are in the infant stage of trying to create a world society, a global society, and a global legal system. The UN wasn't the first. The League of Nations was the first. Then we have the UN. Will something supersede the UN? Do we need another body? Hard to say. But do we need to feel that we're more one as humankind, as opposed to these distinctions of sovereignty? The answer to that is probably yes. Nothing brings people together quicker than a common enemy. If you want everyone on Earth to feel like they're one, get a threat from outer space. Worry that ET is about to attack, everyone's going to be in the same country at that point. So does it take a global threat? I don't know. Maybe it's the threat that the Earth is dying. Maybe that's what will bring people together. But somehow we need to do that, and we are in the early stages of that happening.
Okay, thank you. And what comments do you students have on having laws of nations and preventing war crimes and crimes against humanity? How about you, John?
I think in the end, if we can get to a point where international laws are created and we are living as an international community, I think it will be the best. I think that giving up sovereignty is actually probably a better thing than people usually view it as. So. Okay.
And Rhonda, how about you? A final word, and then I'll see if either Kisper or TJ have a final comment.
Well, just that I think that the world at large needs to be on their toes, as to what humanity is, and that we all, take off our skin. We're all the same inside.
Okay, thank you. And how about you, Kisper? How do we come around to this?
I think ultimately we all want to live in a state of peace, in a state of everybody getting along and not having to have wars, but it's going to be a long time down the road, I believe.
All right, thank you. And TJ, any thoughts about it?
Just what we've all said already, I think, is, that's the big problem, is finding there's no common ground yet between certain countries. There's the democracy, but then there's the other countries that have their own opinions and values, and when we can find that and bring that together, like Wayne was saying, then we can establish that international community, and that's probably a long ways down the road, but that's probably the way we need to go.
Okay, thank you. And from these comments, Wayne, we can see that there are ideals that are privileged when it would come to wars against humanity, and it might be wealthy nations that are privileged, those who already have the scientists, the stockpiles of weapons, and can wage a war in this method where it's usually been done. Terrorists don't have that, but yet they want to know they've been aggrieved.
Yes. It's not just a question of sovereignty. It's the question of the kind of sovereignty you'd want. How many of us would be happy with a sovereign nation that's essentially a theocratic government? It'd be difficult. So it's also an issue of political theory. What kind of government best creates an environment where human beings can become the best that they are, that they can grow and evolve in the way that we ought to evolve? Is it a democracy? Or is democracy not the best for the 21st century? We don't really, we haven't talked about that, make a lot of assumptions about that, but we should discuss it. And so the point I want to make is it's not just that we have a sovereign body, but that you have a sovereign body with a political system that best supports the evolution of human beings in the way you would like.
Thank you. I think that's very profound, because as he closes up his article on page 210, if we could turn to the second column, then Bertram Lesser is telling us that we need to look at this from a moral point of view, an ethical point of view, and a legal point of view. And he says, just as Hobbes has told us, we're a natural person, we have natural conditions, that maybe there might be a way that we can work through this. And Kisper, would you read that final paragraph for us, please, on 210?
The one that starts the worthy sentiments?
Uh-huh.
The worthy sentiments of Grotius, of Seneca, and of all the learned writers who denounced the lawlessness and the cruelties of men and nations at war had little practical effect upon the actual conduct of states or their citizens, for there was no sanction that could meaningfully be applied against those who violated the so-called unwritten laws of war, even after those laws had been reduced to writing by Grotius and those who came after him. Not until the 20th century, when tormented mankind suffered through the most barbarous wars ever waged, did the international community finally take its first halting steps toward making the concepts of war crimes and crimes against humanity meaningful and operative in the lives of nations.
Thank you. And I think it is a very profound conclusion as we look at this, that we're in our infancy then of developing war methods of combating crimes against humanity. Thanks for being here with us, Wayne.
Thank you
It was
for the
great.
invitation.
And thanks to you students. Bye-bye.